Hey everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today we're going to be looking at a Tier 9 Swedish medium tank which is possibly going to be a reward vehicle in 2020. It is the UDES 03 Alt 3. Now it's kind of becoming really frustrating for me that Wargaming keep releasing statistics and screenshots of these Tier 9 tanks with no indication of what they possibly could be for. Now while that's nothing new inside World of Tanks, remember in 2018 when we had a bunch of reward vehicles revealed that eventually would become a second set of personal missions, but they were at various tiers. A lot of the tanks recently have all been at tier 9. Maybe that's because Wargaming, I guess, think that they're onto a winner from 2019 with having a reward for Frontline and also having a reward for the Ranked Battles game mode. Now don't get me wrong, I like the AE Phase 1 and I think I'm looking forward to the Panzerwagen, which is going to be the reward for Ranked, although it doesn't really do too much different. I guess it'll be nice to have the equivalent of a Leopard prototype as a reward vehicle. This tank, on the other hand, looks like it could be quite interesting for me. Not because of flat out the statistics of the vehicle, but because it's going to be the first reward tank with a Hydropneumatic Suspension. So what exactly is a Hydropneumatic Suspension in World of Tanks? Well, it's where the tank is able to elevate itself up and down, a lot like on the Stridsvagn tanks, the Swedish tank destroyers, or on the medium branch that was added, which they're not really too popular. It's interesting that when Wargaming added in the Lansen to the game, they made it without the Hydropneumatic Suspension, even though it's kind of meant to be a crew trainer for the Hydropneumatic Suspension tanks at tiers 8, 9, and 10. Frankly, the Hydropneumatic Suspension is something that's never really taken off too much inside World of Tanks, as it doesn't really provide too much of a benefit. Sure, it can provide you with extra gun depression, but if you could just depress the gun on the turret, it would be far more convenient. And as many of you will know who have tried out the Hydropneumatic Suspension tanks, they really feel quite clunky in my opinion along a ridgeline, because you always have to be facing forwards to be able to get the extra gun depression of the tank, because as soon as you try and aim your gun over the sides, for example, it doesn't quite work out. And so this means that you're constantly having to turn the tank as well as the turret to be able to re-engage your opponents as you use the extra gun depression that the vehicles have. Anyway, before we dig into the statistics of the UDES Alt 3, let's just take a look at the screenshots to see what we have to look forward to. Okay, so the hull looks positively Swedish, a lot like the tier 8, 9, and 10 Swedish tanks. The turret, on the other hand, it kind of looks a bit more like the turret that you would have on the tier 7 Leo, or a Leopard turret, for example, or something that you would have on one of the AMX wheeled light tanks. Or should I say the EBR series? No, it's probably not really a very good thing to have on this vehicle, a gigantic, fat, and flat turret like this. And I guess unless you're really engaging your opponents right from the front, and I guess we can see from this angle, yeah, it's not going to be bouncing too much. Any of you will know from the tier 8 UDES turret, it's definitely not very good. And it's only really the hull armor of a tank like this will be able to pull off some miracle bounces. And that's of course if they don't overmatch, because the tier 8 armor is 35mm at the front and 35mm at the side, which means that you will get overmatched by 120mm caliber guns. Or should I say all 106mm caliber guns and larger, which is definitely not very fun. The armor on the Swedish medium tanks doesn't even really start until you get to tier 9, but one of the huge advantages of the UDES 16, of course, is this tiny forehead on top of the vehicle. What that means is that you can pretty much poke your gun over the ridgeline and expose practically nothing of your tank. That's definitely not something that's going to be happening here, and we're going to have to hope that this thing has some turret armor, especially on the top, or it's going to be a bit of a disaster of a turret. Now, Wargaming have provided us, I must stress, preliminary statistics for the UDES 03 Alt 3, and remember, these characteristics are not final, and as this tank is going to be entering the super test, everything is subject to change. Firstly, immediately to note that this tank is looking like it's going to have a crew of 3, which means that it will be very suitable for the tier 9 and tier 10 Swedish medium tanks, as it has a commander, a gunner, and a driver. Also, this vehicle is going to get 2 types of APCR ammo as standard. It also is premium on the tank, and so once again, it should work out quite a lot like the ammo on the tier 9 Swedish medium tank. Now, to see if these statistics are any good, I've offloaded them onto an Excel spreadsheet so we can see how the tank stacks up with the UDES 03 Alt 3 compared to the tier 8 UDES 14 Alt 5 and also the tier 9 UDES 16. So all 3 of these vehicles have a 105mm gun, but as we can see, not all 105mm guns are equal, with the tier 9 reward tank having 360 alpha damage, the same as the standard tier 8, and being less than the 390 that you would get on the tier 9. The high explosive rounds on this tank pack 460 alpha damage, nothing really special to write home there, considering that the penetration is 53. Now, the standard penetration on the APCR rounds is 252. This is actually really good, way better than on the UDES UDES 16, which has 234. And the gold penetration on this tank is 284. Again, way better than the 263 you'll have on the Tier 9 UDES. And that's definitely a big advantage, and one of the reasons why I never really truly enjoyed the UDES 16. Now, this tank currently has an identical rate of fire to the UDES 16. However, considering the alpha damage is lower, it does take a bit of a hit with regards to the damage per minute at 2,117, which is significantly worse than the 2,300 nearly that the UDES 16 has, but at least it'll be a touch up on the Tier 8, but you would expect it to be, considering this is most likely going to be a Tier 9, well, definitely Tier 9, but most likely going to be a reward vehicle, unless there's some kind of whole new tech tree of Swedish tanks that'll be going into the game, but that would make absolutely no sense because it's so similar to a tech tree that's already there. So, now on to gun handling. 0.35 accuracy, definitely not bad. Just a little bit better than the UDES 16, but significantly better than the UDES 14. The aim time, 1.9 seconds, again, better than the UDES 16, and also the UDES 14. Now on to gun depression. This is where this tank is a little interesting. You might be thinking, what do you mean 7 plus 6? Well, that means that this tank has 7 degrees of gun depression when you're only using the gun, and an extra 6 when you're using the hydropneumatic suspension. And that's fantastic. 13 degrees of gun depression directly in front of the vehicle when you're fully using the hydropneumatic suspension, and that will give you an advantage over the Tier 8 and also over the Tier 9. The Tier 9, while it does have more capacity to elevate the back of the tank, depressing effectively the gun more over the front of the hull, the Tier 9 only has 5 degrees of gun depression if you're not using the hydropneumatic suspension. This makes it quite awkward in close quarters combat to sometimes aim down at your opponent's tracks, or even on their lower plate, or even just aim down on their upper plate, which won't be very well angled, and so it should be easy to penetrate. Or, alternatively, if you just don't have time to stop and slow down, then you will be able to make better use of the 7 degrees of gun depression that the UDES 03 has outside of using that hydropneumatic suspension. But again, even if you do, 13 is definitely better than 12. Elevation on this tank, Wargaming is saying it's 15, but I'm not sure if that's taking into account the hydropneumatic suspension also elevating, as the other two vehicles will be able to get up to 26 and 21 respectively if you're using that. The turret traverse on this tank is 40. Again, that's actually really good. Way, way better than the Tier 8 and significantly better than the Tier 9, which will allow you to re-engage your opponents if they manage to get out of the way of the front of your vehicle. But again, with a tank like this, remember that the hydropneumatic suspension will only mean that you have that maximum gun depression directly in front of the tank. And it means that you've got to try and position yourself in a position where then you're going to be able to keep your opponents in front of you. I know I keep stressing this, but honestly, if you haven't tried out the hydropneumatic suspension tanks, it's so incredibly frustrating to go into a position to find out you have really good gun depression over the front of the vehicle, and you turn the turret quickly to engage somebody who's on the other side of the ridge, and then you have to turn the tank awkwardly, and then it blooms out your reticle, and then you expose your side armor to somebody who was in front of you again. Yeah, it's just really awkward. So any little advantage you can get with regards to the depression outside of the hydropneumatic suspension is a clear advantage, which is why I think the UDES 03 Alt 3 could be so much more comfortable to use than the UDES 16. Alright, so let's talk about mobility of this vehicle now. Now, the engine power is 540, practically identical to the Tier 8 and significantly worse than the Tier 9. And this is significant considering the weight is 30 tons, way heavier than the 22 on the Tier 8 and also heavier than the 28 on the Tier 9. That means that this vehicle has a fairly poor power to weight ratio for what you would consider to be a more mobile medium tank of 18. Why that's by no means slow, it's not incredible. And the 25 that the UDES 18 gets will allow it to zip up slopes. The 21 on the Tier 9 is going to be a big step up. And so the mobility of this vehicle is going to feel significantly worse unless Wargaming massively change the ground resistances of this vehicle, as they will do, and that's something that we don't know with the statistics they provided us. So the vehicle will be limited to 50 forwards, 20 backwards, and 44 on the hull, all fairly standard here. So now on to the big one, because really, I mean, there's nothing truly special about this vehicle. Like 1 extra or 2 extra degrees of gun depression when you're not using the hydropneumatic suspension, gun handling just a little bit better, mobility a little bit worse. It's all very similar, right? So now onto the armor. Maybe that's where this tank is going to be special. And ooh, no, 32 degrees of hull armor at the front, 32 at the side, and 20 at the rear. That means that you are going to get overmatched by all 100mm caliber guns. This seems like such an arbitrary value that Wargaming have picked. I swear they've done it on purpose. 32 will mean that the 3 times that will go up to 96, which means that all 97mm caliber guns and higher are going to be able to overmatch this tank. So all Soviet vehicles, you're going to look at these things like a big, juicy, tasty snack because you're never going to really ever bounce off the hull armor unless it's some kind of ultra extreme angle that you hit. We're talking about kind of 89 degrees of angled armor for the overmatch to not be able to go through here to all intents and purposes. And even the Tier 8 can bounce 105mm caliber guns. And considering how many guns are 100mm and 105mm in caliber, the difference between 32 and 35 doesn't seem like a lot, but actually with the way that it works in World of Tanks, it's massive. It's huge. And that's why the jump up to the Tier 9 UDES 16 with 45mm of armor means that you're going to be bouncing all but 150mm caliber guns rather than being overmatched by them with the well-angled frontal armor that you'll receive. So 40 at the side means that the UDES 16 is going to be overmatched by 122mm caliber guns when it side scrapes. But let's take a look at the turret armor. Ooh, yeah, not great news here. 66 at the front, it's pretty good. 30 at the side, it's horrific. That means that you're going to be overmatched. And I've really got a question. Where is the 60 and where is the 33 going to be? Or shall I say, sorry, where is the 30mm going to be? Now, the 60, probably the mantlet, maybe the upper part. That's going to be so bad if that get overmatched. Hopefully it's going to be all around the front here. And I guess this is going to be the 30s. That's going to be the easiest thing to penetrate with high explosive rounds, let me tell you. I'm hoping that the 60 is going to be all over this part of the tank. It doesn't really seem like it's going to be doing that well, although it's very well angled. But once again, your ammunition choice is very important when you're shooting angled armor like this. Take, for example, when we are shooting at an E50M. Let me show you exactly what I mean here. If we're shooting at an E50M, let's imagine we're firing APCR rounds, and we're going to go into a bit of game mechanics here, but it's very important when you're thinking about armored surface. All right, let's imagine you're firing APCR rounds at an E50M. So we can see that the E50's turret is pretty much perfectly designed for bouncing armor piercing and APCR ammunition. Off the front of the hull, it will be going in, but off the sides, because it's angled at about 75 degrees, that means it's always going to bounce because armor piercing and armor piercing composite ridge ammo will always ricochet if the angle of the armor that they hit is 70 degrees or higher, unless an overmatch happens. And that occurs when the caliber of your gun is over 3 times the thickness of the armor that it hits. And obviously, as the armor of the E50M is 80mm, that means that you'd need a 241mm caliber gun to be able to overmatch it, which doesn't exist. However, did you know that high explosive anti-tank ammo works in a completely different way? High explosive anti-tank will actually penetrate up to 85 degrees of angled armor. And so that is why if you shoot the cheeks of an E50M, you've pretty much got about a 60% chance of going through even from the front when you hit the cheeks, because the angle of the cheeks that you hit will be 75 degrees. And so heat rounds will just be able to completely obliterate relatively thin but angled armor. And so that's exactly what's going to happen here with the UDES. If you load heat, unless you hit, I guess, this kind of what could be a spaced mantlet on the front of the vehicle, you're pretty much always going to be going through the turret cheeks here, because frankly, just 66mm is not thick enough to ever allow it to get up to a very decent effective armor. And God forbid the 30, if it extends towards the front of the turret, then this tank would be truly garbage with regards to its turret armor. I don't really see the point. I guess Wargaming are trying to make this thing like a bit of a glass cannon mobile vehicle, but they're also trying to give it some armor. I don't see the ideology of this vehicle. Sure, the Hydropneumatic Suspension is great, but why would you want to play a tank like this when you could just play the Tier 9 regular UDES 16 and actually have armor that's worth something? Finally, this vehicle has 1,600 hit points and really poor view range at 380, which means unless you are using coated optics and a very skilled crew, you're never going to get up to a very decent view range mark. And if you aren't using a skilled crew, then you're probably going to have to end up taking binoculars on this vehicle. And so the UDES 03 Alt 3, I just really don't see what Wargaming are trying to go for with this vehicle. I can see what their thinking is. Their thinking is, we have hydropneumatic tanks inside the game. We have no hydropneumatic suspension reward vehicles available for people who want to crew train their crews in those tanks, and they have to take them and put them in things like the Lancer, which don't have that core game mechanic. The thing is that I feel that Wargaming's Hydropneumatic Suspension is probably one of their weaker additions to the game, outside of course, how they worked on the tank destroyers. When they worked on the tank destroyers, I felt like it was novel. You went into it, you chose to go into like a siege mode, then you could use the hydropneumatic suspension and it turned the Swedish tank destroyers into these kind of like hold the line beasts that you probably wouldn't want to sit in front of, especially towards the tier 9 and tier 10 mark. For the medium tanks, like on the SDB1 and also on the high tier Swedish medium tanks, I just really feel as if it is an advantage because you can just do some really funky ridgeline work if you need to be able to depress the gun to an incredible amount to be able to engage your opponents. But more often than not, as Wargaming have probably clearly shown with the buff that they had to make to the SDB1, it's just a real horrible feeling to have to use it. And you'd rather just have a tank that has clean gun depression that you can use on the move, that you don't have to slow down, and that you can use all the way around the vehicle, apart from most of the time right over the back. And the reason why I say that Wargaming have clearly shown this is because the SDB1, when they changed it, they didn't really make it that good. They had to increase the gun depression of the SDB1 from 6 degrees to 8 degrees in the 1.5.1 patch. And that's because for a while when Wargaming changed the SDB1, when it only had 6 degrees of gun depression outside of using the hydropneumatic suspension, just made the tank, fair enough, able to depress 12 degrees instead of 10 over the front, but to only have 6 degrees over the side was completely horrific. Now that Wargaming have changed it so that it's got 8 degrees on top of the hydropneumatic suspension, wow, now it can have 14 over the front, which is ridiculous, while also having 8 degrees over the side. It does feel very comfortable. And so, while that kind of gives me a little bit of hope for the UDES 3 Alt 3, that it will have 7 degrees of gun depression outside of the hydropneumatic suspension, I just don't really see the point of it. It just feels as if it's not going to be a truly special tank, at least at the moment. Why would you want to sacrifice alpha damage, mobility of the vehicle, to be able to gain just a little bit of gun handling and a little bit of penetration on the tank? But for me personally, just because Wargaming have obviously discovered that the player base are willing to do a hell of a lot to be able to get tier 9 reward vehicles, that doesn't mean that they should put so many into the game so quickly that maybe we feel a little bit hard pressed to be able to achieve them all, or more importantly, that it actually impacts the quality of the vehicles that are released. And I do feel that while this is early days for the UDES 3 Alt 3, doesn't really feel like it's going to be a very novel vehicle. And you'd think that I would be more excited for a hydropneumatic suspension reward vehicle, the first of its kind to be able to go into the game. And so that's it, ladies and gents, for today. That was the UDES 03 Alt 3. Do you agree with me that you personally think this one looks a little lackluster, or do you think maybe I'm missing something about the tank? Do let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, but if you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And a passing mention should be made that tomorrow is going to be one of my favorite days of the year, and that is that I'm streaming for 12 hours in aid of cancer research and special effect. Since 2013, we've raised $150,000 as a community. Please come along and join me and add to that tomorrow, and hopefully I'll see you then.